So let's get started. Let's teleport ourselves back to the summer of 2001, Liam, when I was a wee 9-year-old and you were a wee 4-year-old.
I hadn't turned 4. I would have been 3.
If you think about that landscape where wrestling was at that stage, WWE had bought WCW, they had bought ECW, Ring of Honor had not been formed yet. Wrestling was in a pretty dire place. You know, it was WWE and everything else was tiny or terrible. And there wasn't a lot of opportunities out there if you couldn't work for WWE, which was a bit of a problem for Jeff Jarrett, given he was publicly fired on the final episode of Nitro, and he held up WWE for 150 grand against China. So he needed places to work. And I think that's like the real genesis of TNA. There'd always be like, oh, you know, there's creating an alternative to give people opportunities in wrestling. But I think push comes to shove. Jeff Jarrett knew he needed somewhere where he could wrestle regularly, and that did not exist in the year 2001, and it didn't exist really in the year 2002 either. We'll talk about a couple of alternatives that popped up and died, but he had to put his money where his mouth is, because otherwise he probably wouldn't have been able to wrestle for the rest of his career. Because obviously he did come back to WWE. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2018 and made an actual in-ring return in the Royal Rumble in, I think it was 2019.
Still has a job there,
and he still has a job there today, indeed. So it wasn't like iced out for the rest of his life, but he was iced out from, what was it, 1999 to 2018. That's a pretty long period of not being able to work there.
Hey, Jeff Jarrett stay winning though. Let's give the man credit where it's.
Yeah, the genesis of TNA really does come from he needed somewhere to work, and there, as I mentioned, there were a couple of alternatives. There was stuff that popped up to try and fill the void post WCW, which was World Wrestling All Stars, which did a bunch of pay-per-views, many of which were in Australia.
Ah,
did you go to any of those or hear about any of those?
I was 4.
You might have went to things.
No,
because it was founded by Andrew McManus, who's a big music promoter. Andrew McManus, by the way, founder of World Wrestling All Stars, was arrested in Australia in connection with alleged importation of 300 kilograms of cocaine and money laundering in 2015. So
I'm a fan of that. Fair enough.
Those are the kind of people that were getting into wrestling in the year 2002. So they would have done regular pay-per-views. They would have done weekly pay-per-views, but they would have done like big quarterly pay-per-views with big stars like Randy Savage and Scott Steiner and Sting and Jeff Jarrett. And some of them, like, it was basically a precursor to TNA in a lot of ways. It had a lot of the similar talent, but it was going for these big, like, tentpole pay-per-views as opposed to smaller weekly pay-per-views.
How many shows did they get through?
Oh, I think there was like 10. Let me check.
So you're saying it'd be a fine series for us to track down the World Wrestling All-Star shows?
Yeah, sure. It would be interesting to watch. Those shows look terrible, but I'm sure you could watch them.
Like, yeah, I'm sure you could watch them.
According to Cage Match, they had 30 shows, which is more than I thought.
Oh,
I think
no, that's way too much then. I'm not committing to that.
No, I think a lot of them were live events. I think that in terms of pay-per-views, they did a lot fewer, because they did the Reckoning, the Retribution, the Eruption, the Revolution, and the Inception.
Revolution?
So, yeah, wow. I think there was 5...
trendsetters
pay-per-views, which, by the way, their first show, the Inception, in Sydney, has a Cage Match rating of 2.5.
That's good. That's good stuff right there. That's what you want to see.
The main event of which was Jeff Jarrett versus Road Dogg in a cage.
I hope they were playing off of the, like, 90s WWF angle.
Probably were. That's all they ever did with Jeff Jarrett and Road Dogg. They also had Hoovy against Psychosis in a ladder match. That's not bad, I suppose.
Hoovy, of course, has a very tepid history with Australia.
Yeah, big fan of Australia.
And Australian law enforcement.
There was a battle royal that 3 of which of the participants are just question mark on Cage Match, and if the Germans don't know, nobody knows.
It was probably Kangaroo Jim, Outback Bob, and Terry.
So, like, those shows kind of flopped. They did. They'll just leave that there. You can be racist toward Australia because you're Australian. It's fine.
That's how it works.
World Wrestling All-Stars didn't really get off the ground, and Jeff Jarrett wasn't happy with how that was being run. He thought it should be more episodic. He thought there should be more stories, which informed the kind of product he ended up creating.
Man does love stories.
Yes, that does make wrestling better, usually, to be fair. Give me just matches. You just want your Ring of Honor.
Yeah, I was actually like, I don't want to keep taking you off of your thing. Just very quickly, but do you ever wonder, like, if your brother had to come back with, like, some Ring of Honor, like, Final Battle 2003 or something?
Some Best of Samoa Joe DVD.
Yeah, would you have been like this big ROH guy?
Maybe I would have. Maybe that would have changed the fate of my life forever.
That would have changed the wrestling business forever.
Or maybe I just would have been like, this shit sucks. And I would have just abandoned wrestling forever.
Where's my production value?
I would have been like you burying Chris Hero, being like, this isn't wrestling.
40 minutes. All right, I'll now shut up and let you go through the rest of this.
No, you can derail me all you want. That's the fun. There was also the XWF, which was like Hulk Hogan led, but the big problem was they recorded like a full season of TV and then went to shop it around. But by the time they were like shopping into networks, Hulk had already gone back to WWF. Kurt Hennig was one of their big stars who already went back to WWF. So they were like going into TV meetings with TV executives, showing them these tapes. It's like that has Hulk Hogan on these shows, which I'm sure would have piqued interest. But then it's like, oh, so he's going to be on the show? It's like, he's on this season. It's like, what about other seasons? And it's like, don't you worry about that.
I think I've seen some of this.
Oh, yeah, the DVD's out there. I have it on my shelf here.
Didn't Punk do something with this too?
Well, that would have been very early. It would have been 2001, maybe?
I think maybe it was some undercard stuff. Because it was kind of like another weird proto-TNA thing where it had a lot of indie guys who were like just good wrestlers on the undercard, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
I guess like that was kind of the whole thing of the time, wasn't it? It was like, who can we get? Who's available?
Because that's the thing we're going to talk about when I'm talking about the founding of TNA. It's like just that indie scene, which like there is a lot of very promising young wrestlers coming through. Or you have the likes of Samoa Joe breaking through. You have the likes of Christopher Daniels, who's been there for a decade. He's not a young wrestler, but he's breaking through. Obviously, the Ring of Honor cohort, the likes of the Amazing Red, the likes of Loki, the likes of Bryan Danielson. So like there is a new generation that's coming, but like if you look at the talent landscape in the year 2001, which is even pre Ring of Honor, you're just like, oh god, wrestling is doomed.
Yeah, and also it's like, sure, there's a lot of really good guys on the come up, but like, where are your stars to carry the brand?
That's the other big issue. Like a lot of them were still being paid by WCW, still being paid by Time Warner, so they weren't working anywhere.
And not being willing to drop those contracts in any way. Like, I'm just gonna, or not being able to. It's like, I got, nah.
Well, some of them could. That's the thing. DDP gave up his to go work for the Fed, and look how that worked for him. So a lot of them, like the Steiners and the Bookers, or not the Bookers, the Stings of the world that didn't take the buyouts, and they're just like, we'll just coast here because Time Warner is paying us out for the rest of our contract. And I can't blame them. I'd probably do the same thing.
Well, it worked out for DDP, so.
Yeah, he had a great career in the World Wrestling Federation. So yeah, XWF flopped. World Wrestling All-Stars flopped. There was no real national alternative to WWE in 2002. Obviously, Ring of Honor was founded in February of 2002. February, right? Yeah, February. And, you know, they had their niche. They had their thing, but it was never remotely in the same league as WWE. And it was never intended to be either. That's the thing. I'm not being like, Ring of Honor couldn't compete with WWE. They weren't trying to. They were doing their own thing. They were doing their small-scale independent. They helped create, like, the boom of independent wrestling, which kind of still lives this day. Let's see how that goes in the next couple of years. So Jeff Jarrett, Bob Ryder, and Jerry Jarrett went fishing in 2001 and pitched this concept of a pay-per-view only wrestling company, because the big issue with World Wrestling All-Stars, the big issue with XWF in the end, was that they couldn't get television and then died. So they were like, how do we circumvent that? We're not going to be able to get TV either, so we're just going to do a pay-per-view only wrestling company, which is a terrible idea. It's just an abysmal, stupid idea, because like the backbone of pro wrestling for the prior like 15 years was, we have our free television on which we will promote live events and we will promote pay-per-view. And that's how you got people to actually watch the pay-per-views. You built the matches on television and then aired the matches on pay-per-view, and people bought the pay-per-view. But without the free television, the free vehicle to promote that pay-per-view, how do people find out about your product? Especially in 2002, where you don't have the hope of gaining internet buzz. Not that the internet didn't exist.
Yeah, because the internet didn't exist, as we all know.
Because we have so many of those posts like, what if the internet existed in 2002?
What if the internet was around when Jeff Jarrett was running a company, huh?
Yeah, he would have been fine. Everything would have went well.
People would have loved it.
Because like so much of the marketing and buzz for these shows did come from the internet. Like you see Jeff Jarrett and Jerry Jarrett and Jeremy Borash doing interviews with the Wrestling Observer, doing extensive interviews with the PW Torch about the founding of this company. That's how they got their word out. But like the internet was not remotely the force it is today. It didn't have social media. Stuff couldn't go viral. If you wanted to get your word out, it's slow and steady, and it's through other people's platforms. That's the only way you could do it back in 2002. So the idea of doing this weekly pay-per-view model where you want to sell a minimum of 50,000 pay-per-views every single week, it was not particularly viable.
Do you think that would be a idea that would function better in 2021? Because, like, you know, a $9 price point isn't the worst.
Well, it's basically like the backbone of the streaming model when you think about it. Like, instead of paying $9 per pay-per-view, you pay $9 a month to Progress, you pay $9 a month to New Japan, and you get all of their shows for the month. So it's more affordable and it's more accessible. So it kind of works now. Like, if New Japan, because the New Japan did charge piecemeal per show, if you remember back in the Ustream days, and people paid it, but not in large numbers. I don't think people would pay for each individual New Japan show like on a $9.99 like price tag on a show by show basis. I don't think that would work. I don't think people pay for that. But as in terms of like the here's everything and you get all the archives, that does work, and people can find like viable models on both an independent level and a mainstream level with that these days.
I think it's curious too, because there is some examples of companies doing that now. GCW, each show is a single purchase on Fight. And then you go to go back to New Japan, they do like their G1 or their Wrestle Kingdom specials, right? Where you buy not each show individually, but it's some sort of overarching price point that you will get all these shows for. So I think it's funny. That's like for an idea that didn't work then. There is still traces of it in 2021's wrestling production.
Yeah, even if you look last year, that NWA offshoot, was it UWF, the Dave Marquez one, basically did the weekly pay-per-view model.
UWF is Glate.
Whatever it was called. It was something. Well, you know the company I'm talking about, the fake NWA that was on pay-per-view last summer.
Yeah, I'll find it. Give me one sec.
So they literally did the weekly pay-per-view model. They did a pay-per-view every week, and it clearly died a death because they started giving away everything for free like 2 weeks after it ended. So they clearly generated no interest whatsoever, and it didn't work. And like you mentioned GCW, like it is obviously operating on a much smaller scale.
United Wrestling Network.
So UWN, not UWF. I was a letter off.
Very different things, though, to be fair.
Hey, if they did shoot fighting between Damian Sandow and freaking Eli Drake, maybe people would have watched it.
You know, I've just clicked on the UWF thing for a little sidebar. A match that happened on UWF Primetime Live 4, Chris Dickinson versus Max Caster.
Well, there you go. Clearly AEW was watching.
Yeah.
Recruiting the UWN talent.
Not the UWF talent. No Minoru Tanaka.
So yeah, they started with the weekly pay-per-view model. I completely forgot where I was after you mentioned Minoru Tanaka. My brain clearly is like, ooh, Minoru Tanaka.
Yeah.
So they decided on that model as like the reason they did it at the end of the day is they had no other option. Like the only other option was to do like a Ring of Honor approach where it's much smaller scale, where it's much more like we're going to build this kind of grassroots promotion from the ground up. It's going to be much more low budget, more based on independent wrestling talent, cheap talent. But they wanted the swing for the fences. They wanted a national company. It was always intended to be a national company. I would recommend there's basically two primary sources now for the foundation of TNA. The one I would most recommend is Jerry Jarrett's book and the foundation and development of TNA, which is very easy to get these days. You can just get it on Amazon. Or like Jeff Jarrett has just done a 3-part series on the foundation of TNA in which he basically just reads his dad's book and occasionally corrects it. So just buy the book. But I find it interesting. The thing I find most interesting listening to that, aside from the fact that they don't admit basically that the weekly pay-per-view idea was a calamitous mistake that failed very quickly before they were bailed out by Panda. But the thing they don't talk about that kind of drives me mad, they don't talk about what like their actual vision for TNA was supposed to be. We're starting this wrestling company, which is cool. It's a cool idea. You're building this thing from the ground up. You're building this thing. You're creating it. But they had no like clear vision of the kind of product they wanted to offer. There was never like, this is our identity, other than like, we want to be an alternative to WWE. So what does that mean? And if you look at these shows, if you watch these shows, it's like they're not an alternative to WWE. They're a worse version of what WWE did like years before. And it really frustrates me to like, listen, they did like 8 hours of shows, Jeff Jarrett and Conrad Thompson. And at no stage were they like, so, you know, what did you want TNA to be? Like, surely that's one of the most important things you talk about when you found a company, right?
I guess the idea there is that perhaps there was too many people with too varying opinions on what the company was supposed to be.
Which I think goes to an idea that we're an issue that we're going to talk about, I think, a lot throughout this podcast. That actually, if you listen to that Jarrett podcast, it's very clear that him and Jerry were constantly on different pages throughout like the early development of TNA, because Jerry would mention that they were doing one thing, and like this Jerry Jarrett book it was his journal at the time. He was writing a journal while he was founding TNA, and then he published it as a book. So it's like as primary a source as you get. It's the man's journal thoughts the day they happened. And Jarrett's like, oh, some of that never happened. And it's like, it clearly did. It's just your dad was doing things that you didn't know about, or that he just didn't tell you about, which isn't exactly an ideal way to start the company. But also, we'll talk about this again in 2014 TNA, but Vince Russo was kind of secretly working for the company. It's amazing that 2 separate periods in TNA history, there's like Vince Russo shadow booking the company.
If you have to make someone a shadow booker, they're probably not worth bringing in.
It's amazing. It's like, we want you, but no one will like the fact that we have you, so we're not going to tell people. Like, there's this fascinating exchange in a Wade Keller torch talk with Jerry Jarrett, where he's talking about like, and fair play to Wade Keller, who puts him on the spot. He's like, does Vince Russo work for you or collect a paycheck? And Jerry Jarrett's like, no. But then Wade Keller follows up with like, but does he have any creative input to the product? And Jerry's like, well, you know, yes, but no, but yes. And it just comes back to the fact that obviously Vince Russo is a close friend of Jeff Jarrett. Jeff Jarrett's biggest push of his career came from Vince Russo in WCW. So Jeff obviously felt like either he owed Vince Russo something, or that Vince Russo was the best guy to present him on television. And he just couldn't cut him loose. Because like Vince Russo was hired by WWE like days after TNA started. Days after the June 90th pay-per-view. That's when he went back to WWE for like a day before he was fired nearly immediately. But they still couldn't let him go. He's like, he still has to be this foundational part of the company.
He even got a way out.
Yeah, it's like, god damn it.
They still brought him back into the fold.
He could have just been like, oh yeah, Vince, happy for you to go off to W. Because like, if you read Jerry Jarrett's book, we'll get into the quotes because they're later in June 2002. We'll get into the quotes later, specifically about Vince Russo. But he detested Vince Russo.
You know what, Jerry? Me too, man.
He buries Vince Russo 6 feet under multiple times. He said, like, this guy doesn't know wrestling. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's stupid. So it's clear that, like, that friction and that tension existed from the very beginning. That, like, Jerry Jarrett had this idea of what this company should be, which is, like, very traditional wrestling. Jerry Jarrett made all his money in Memphis. So that kind of wrestling, that kind of, like, easy to understand stories, main event guys and main events, opening guys and opening contests. And there'll be some stuff that maybe hasn't aged particularly well that we will talk about when we get to reviewing these shows. That there's some stuff in these shows that are just absolutely vile, honestly.
Which you can also hear our reaction to.
Oh, indeed. Like, go and listen to our on the $10 tier on Patreon, just to hear our visceral reactions to some of the homophobia and racism, because we did a live watch along of NWA-TNA pay-per-view number 1.
And ableism. It's all there. It's literally everything that you could hope for.
What do you want? It's literally all in the show. It's clear that like Jerry Jarrett wanted to be more a traditional wrestling product. That obviously it ended up being nothing like that, and that ended up actually being one of the key stories throughout the first year of the company: traditional wrestling versus sports entertainment extreme. We'll get to that in months to come. It bled onto the show as a storytelling device. Even the commentary team was apparently kind of designed like that, where Ed Ferrara was meant to be the sports entertainment guy, and Mike Tenay was meant to be the serious sports guy, and they were meant to like argue and clash.
Well, you know what? Despite I don't like Ed Ferrara, I do think he succeeds in that role.
Yeah, he is annoying about pushing sports entertainment on you.
But like, I get it. Like, even from a character perspective, like I think it's fine. Like, if he's the guy who's like going, oh yeah, I like the angles and the blah blah blah, and that's why I'm here, and I'm gonna put that over, and I'm gonna put the heels over. But it also like intrinsically tells the audience that the sports entertainment stuff is garbage.
Yeah.
Because the guy who was voicing that he likes it is the garbage guy on the commentary.
They're at least nice enough to tell you that.
And that's like even a common theme between these first few shows, is that there's a lot of self-loathing on these shows where they seemingly hate their own booking already.
Yep.
they they hate the angles they're putting on there. They hate the show, and they hate this might come from what we're talking about with the everyone has a different view of it. It's like they're burying their own show from the beginning, and I think that was the most interesting takeaway as I was watching too. I was like, why do they hate everything they're putting out there?
I do wonder, is that like, obviously somebody booked the Gauntlet for the Gold for the world title, and then a bunch of people come out at the start of these shows. Like Jeff Jarrett, it's fine, he's the heel. Him coming out and saying, "Oh, I have to win a 20-man gauntlet match to become champion. That's terrible." And then he's given his comeuppance by being made #1 in the gauntlet. That's like that works, that makes sense. That's a heel being a heel and getting his comeuppance. But then like Ken Shamrock comes out and it's like, "Yes, Jeff, I agree with you that this is a terrible idea, but I guess we have to do it." Before then, also Scott Hall comes out, both of whom are baby faces, by the way, Scott Hall and Ken Shamrock. Scott Hall also comes out and is like, "Yeah, man, it's such a dumb idea that we're doing this battle royal for the title. Oh, it's so terrible." So I do wonder if it's like deliberate sabotage, that like somebody else is like, "Oh, I'm going to script these promos to bury this booking decision that I don't like."
But it's not even specifically that either. Like there's other things on this show that like the commentary is just shitting on.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. I wonder if there was certain people in other people's ears like, "Hey, Ed, I need you to really shit talk this segment for me. Hey, Mike, can you really bury the sports entertainment stuff for me?"
It is kind of fascinating to see that play out on air, like in a way that's really tangible and clear to see. And like it may be just like they're setting up this story that they're building toward the sports entertainment extreme stuff, where it still doesn't make for particularly compelling television, that pretty much every segment has somebody telling you that part of it sucks for some reason.
Yeah, it's like you can do that and have subtle story tells, but it's like you don't need to bury the show while you're doing it. Because like, especially, it wouldn't even be that bad if it wasn't on TV, but you're asking people to pay a price point every week while telling them the show is bad.
It's such a TNA thing to do from the very start, isn't it?
It's kind of mind-boggling, like how it's almost the worst start to a promotion you could fucking do.
The entire show spends the entire show telling you that the show sucks and you're a dumbass for spending $10 on it and you should never do it again.
And then ends it with, "And we'll see you next week. Make sure you slap in that $10 to go watch Scott Hall and Jeff Jarrett."
So we can bury you again for showing up and watching all this garbage.
Yeah, there's immediately like a test for for their own viewership. It's very odd.
It's remarkable that like disdain for their own audience was there from the very beginning.
Something that WWE has picked up and carried along the finish line.
That's what people don't understand when like I criticize WWE. It's like I am very familiar with all of these signs from the downfall of TNA, and they're repeating them like verbatim, and people are like, "Oh, it's gonna be fine." It's like, and WWE are much more insulated from that because they make way more money than TNA ever did. But the problems are still there, and those problems are very hard to fix the longer you ignore them.
I'm curious, like, if you had to do like a direct comparison point, like, could you what era of TNA is the closest to 2021 WWE from that perspective?
It's probably like 2014, where like everybody every week would come out and say how much the show sucked.
So you mean the era when everyone stopped watching?
Yeah, because like every week there'd be a promo where somebody would like, "Dixie Carter, you're running this company into the ground. This company has so much potential, but you're ruining it." And MVP would cut that promo and then turn heel, and then somebody else would cut that promo on MVP, and it would happen over and over again. That's like everyone knows the show sucks. Nobody is over. Nobody's going anywhere. There's no momentum. Occasionally you get some good matches, but that's about it. And it reminds me so much of 2014 TNA, when the year they got dumped off Spike, which they actually did turn it around the second half of the year. They had some good stuff in the second half of the year, but the first half of that year is just dire. So we talked about the roster. Obviously, they wanted some of the big stars that were available at the time, but couldn't get them. They tried to get Luger. They couldn't get Luger. They approached Bret Hart. There's mention in the Wrestling Observer of a Team Canada that features Harry Smith, TJ Wilson, and Teddy Hart, which like TJ Wilson would have been like 17 at that stage, I think.
I think it's interesting that they clearly had that Team Canada idea from like the beginning.
Yeah, clearly they loved that idea in WCW, the Team Canada that had Elix Skipper in it and Jim Duggan, all the famous Canadians. They wanted to bring it back. They also wanted Randy Savage, but couldn't get him. Sting, couldn't get him either. Steiner was an interesting one in that like Steiner and Jeff Jarrett are best friends. They're huge pals, but they couldn't get him either. Steiner eventually went back to the WWF, or WWE at the time, of course, to beat up Chris Sawinski.
Well, he also had like the Triple H stuff at that point, right? Was that earlier?
No, this was 2002. Steiner was still a free agent. He didn't go back until Survivor Series that year.
Yeah, so he did the World Heavyweight title stuff as well.
Yeah, but TNA would have been long founded by then. But Jeff Jarrett's best pal, he couldn't get him. So, like, when you look at the market, when you look at the names they ended up getting, there's like Ken Shamrock, who's an interesting wrestler, an interesting star, but hasn't been around on a national stage for 2 to 3 years at that stage. So he's not like a big relevant name. Obviously, he's a huge name in the UFC at that stage. He has those fights with Tito Ortiz that year that effectively saves the UFC as like not only that saves MMA probably. The history of MMA is very different without the Ken Shamrock or Tito Ortiz fights, because if the UFC doesn't make it, it's probably not a mainstream thing these days. So Ken Shamrock was a huge star in the fight world at that stage, but not so much in the wrestling world.
At least he was still on like the tip of people's tongues. Like he was still a name for something.
Yeah, he wasn't a nobody, but like I suppose it would be equivalent to, he's not a CM Punk level star, but Punk hasn't been around wrestling for a long time either, and if he came back it would be a big deal. So maybe I'm being harsh on Ken Shamrock, but he's the biggest star they have. They couldn't get Sting, they couldn't get Savage, they couldn't get Luger. A lot of these people they did end up getting eventually, for one way or another, for one period or another. Some longer than others. Obviously Steiner and Sting had long runs, whereas Luger and Savage did not. But when you take all those people off the table, there's not that much in the way of star power out there anymore. You have Jeff Jarrett, you have Scott Hall, you have Ken Shamrock as people who like people know, and then there's the likes of Rick Steiner and Buff Bagwell, who I think people know but people don't care about.
The Vampire Warrior.
Yes, Vampire Warrior, who wasn't like heavily promoted. He was just announced a few days beforehand as being in the Gauntlet for the Gold, and then never showed up again. Clearly, nobody's a Gangrel fan.
He shot out early, so obviously they can't keep a guy around who can't even obey the rules of the Gauntlet of the Gold.
Shane Douglas, very funny. They were like, Shane, we want you to do the show, and Shane Douglas, Francine was already booked at the time. Shane Douglas was like, it's me or it's Francine, and then they're like, oh, we've already booked Francine, so it's Francine. It's like and apparently the franchise was bragging about that afterwards. It's like, oh, they got Francine, they don't got me. It's like you just worked yourself out of money there, pal. You're
like
not
in a company that's desperate for stars.
They're literally looking for anybody, and you can talk. So like you would have been pretty good. I'd imagine they would have taken you, but no, the franchise at the franchise.
You know, he made his way in eventually.
He did. They all made their way in eventually, except the only one that didn't, that was talked about beforehand, was Bret Hart, who didn't make his way in eventually. But pretty much everybody else did, and you know, it's a roster. It's such a weird group of people, but it's a group of people.
And to be fair, like there's some stuff in there, you know, even at the early stages. You got the makings of some stuff, but it's definitely a weird assortment of characters.
And like the first person they signed two major wrestlers to long-term contracts, and by long-term contracts we mean 26-day contracts, which at the time was intended to be a 1-year contract, because at launch they intended to do their first show live and then tape a show after that. So that's one date for somebody. So that takes everybody they have signed through a year. And the two people they signed were Ken Shamrock, who was meant to be their like big ace name.
To be fair, that's a good signing.
As good as they could probably get. Mm-hmm. And then the second one, even better, the phenomenal AJ Styles.
See, that's some good foresight, right?
To be fair, yeah, there's people who will always say to you that TNA didn't know what they had with AJ Styles. And it's like, he was one of the very, very, very few people they signed to a 1-year contract at the start. Like, basically everybody else was signed to either like a 1-show contract, or in the case of Hall, I think it was something like 4 shows. So like the vast majority of people you saw on the very first NWA-TNA show were not signed to long-term deals. That's the way they set this thing up. Like they very much expressly did not want a lot of overheads. So all of their like production, all of their PR, all of that stuff was outsourced, and a vast majority of the talent were signed to short-term deals, which was a big reason people didn't have any faith in it, because one, they were like, oh, you're obviously not confident enough to tie people down, but the second one thing was also like, if any of these people catch on, W is just going to sign them because you have none of them under contract. Which W didn't do, because W were in a weird place during that era where they didn't sign people like AJ Styles.
It wasn't 2020.
Yeah, where it's just like, we're going to hire Robbie E just so nobody else can have him. It is a salient point that if you don't have people tied down, that WWE can just be like, oh yeah, we'll take him, great, thanks for making him a star. But yeah, people argue that they didn't know what they had with AJ Styles, and it's just absolute nonsense, given he was one of the very, very few people they actually signed to a deal.
Well, also, like, I think a lot of people may base that because on that, like, especially on that first show, they see AJ first match and losing, and they're probably like, but it's like, even from the first two shows, you can tell that AJ was clearly a guy that they were really high on.
Yep.
Like, he was in that first match, and he was highlighted in that first match.
Well, by being pinned, but sure.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. Like, there was story. At least they had tried to establish a story with him. They gave him times to shine throughout the match. They gave him an out with getting hit before he got pinned, and then immediately on the next show, they had him in the main event with the X title and showing off. Basically, like, that entire match was basically just a whole exercise in how to show off AJ Styles to an audience.
Mm-hmm.
Not a great story for it all, but they clearly liked AJ a lot immediately.
He was clearly intended to be one of the very few people to come out of these first couple shows as like a guy you should actually care about. No, they didn't know what they had with AJ.
Oh, he's already biting it back against the IWC. This is going to be the big feud of this series. It's going to be you taking on everyone online with their tweets on the Twitter machine.
It's basically, this podcast is basically entirely my opportunity to correct the record on people being wrong about TNA.
And then me to, like, be the realist who goes, yeah, there's a lot of bad.
How dare you?
As we'll get when we get into the actual, like, more stuff about the shows.
Yeah, if you look at our star ratings, the list is on the $1 per year tier on Patreon. Basically, all yours are just slightly lower than mine. It's like, hey.
I think I am curious, like, going off topic from the formation for a second, on, you know, especially Asylum stuff. Like, Asylum to, as we said, like, what, 09, I have very little knowledge base on. So it's coming in from me going in there, basically watching stuff either for the first time or just the second time, really. And you, like, the foremost TNA guy on the internet. So, like, it's going to be like, you know, I think in general, when it comes to wrestling, you're a little less forgiving than I am, right?
Mm-hmm.
But are we going to reach a point where it's like, oh, Garrett clearly has, like, some nostalgia goggles here. And I'm going to come in here and go, actually...
You were the objective star rater.
Yeah. I am curious to see, like, how much that plays into it. But, like, this wasn't... Like, you weren't watching, like, this era of TNA at the time.
No. It is the era of TNA that I would have the least nostalgia for.
So I expect that to be more around the 05, 06 era. And beyond.
So they wanted a bunch of NWA legends for the opening ceremony to get the belt prestige.
And boy, did they get them.
Well, to be fair, they did get a bunch of them. They're like Ricky Steamboat, Harley Race, Dory Funk Jr. Those are good level, like, NWA stars, people who have strong association with that championship and with that legacy to kind of show up and tell you how important it is. Mm-hmm. They also had Jackie Fargo, Corsica Joe, Sarah Lee, but sure.
They had Jackie Fargo be there for like 5 hours of the first two shows.
I like the way it's like, Harley Race and Dory Funk are much bigger stars than Jackie Fargo, but Jackie Fargo is a bigger local star, perhaps. But like, Jackie Fargo plays a huge role in that show, whereas, like...
That's because Jarrett likes him.
Jeff Jarrett famously ripped off the strut from Jackie Fargo. To be fair, Steamboat also plays a big role.
Steamboat plays a big role in both shows too.
They also wanted Dusty Rhodes, but Dusty was like, no, I want a lot of money. And also Dusty apparently was like, actually, you're taping 2 shows at once, so this is 2 bookings, not 1. So I want double the money. Fair play to Dusty.
Always a worker.
Dan Severn becomes a big point of contention on the Jeff Jarrett podcast, where it's like, Dan Severn was NWA champion heading into these shows, and the long-held story, the story that's backed up in Jerry Jarrett's book, is that Dan Severn was double booked on the launch date on June 19th. It was not available, so stripped of the title, and they went into the gauntlet match. And the way Jeff Jarrett goes on about it, he did not want Dan Severn on his show. I've never heard a man have more hatred for Dan Severn in my life.
What happened between Dan Severn and Jeff Jarrett?
I don't know. Conrad kind of pokes at him. It's like, what happened here? Why do you... Because, like, it's not like, we have no interest in Dan Severn. It's like, he's like, Dan Severn was not going to be on my show. It's like, whoa, dude.
Do you think Dan Severn beat him up?
He shot on him, yeah. And, like, there's such an easy story there because Dan Severn and Ken Shamrock were UFC rivals. So, sure, like, a really cool match to book would be Dan Severn against Ken Shamrock.
2 pioneers of the sport in the US.
And, like, maybe it wouldn't be the most charismatic, dynamic match in the world in terms of, like, promos and stuff, but it's such an easy story that might actually generate some interest.
A Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock pay-per-view main doesn't sound like a terrible idea for a company trying to get any and all buzz.
Especially on this, like, your freaking pay-per-view main event ended up being Malice against Ken Shamrock. Like,
Hey!
and I like Malice, but nobody cared about the Wall, you know? No one was like, oh, the Wall's on the show?
That's why it wasn't pitched as Malice versus Ken Shamrock for the NWA title, was it? Do you have any problem with the Battle Royal for the world title?
I don't. I think it's a perfectly fine way to crown it. Like, I would prefer a tournament. Like, I always prefer a tournament.
Yeah. But if you have to do like a one-day kind of, we got to get it in there and out there. I think I have a less problem with it because it ends in a singles match anyway.
Yeah, the Tna Gauntlet Format, which is Royal Rumble, but the last two ends in pinfall and submission.
Which I think might be the best way to do it.
Yeah, WWE should have changed it years ago, but they're too stuck in their ways.
Come on, Casino Battle Royal, just ditch it. Gauntlet for the gold, baby.
Like, realistically, looking at the roster they had, if you were to do a one-night tournament instead of a Battle Royal, the tournament matches would have sucked, you know? You're doing Vampire Warrior against Ken Shamrock,
Malice,
Buff Bagwell against Malice, Rick Steiner against Apollo, you know? I'm trying to put together tournament matches here.
Excuse me, it would be Rick Steiner versus Scott Hall, Jeff Jarrett versus Apollo.
There you go. But like, would you like to see that one-night tournament? I wouldn't. So I'm more on board with the idea of just doing a gauntlet in that case.
I don't know, man. 4 Malice matches is right up my alley.
James Storm and Chris Harris, actually, they were not signed originally. I don't even think they were on people's radar. But on June 1st, on an independent show, they did on a Burt Prentice show, they did a match on that show where TNA were just in the building. They had like Don West and Ed Ferrara there. Jim Cornette also got in a fight with Ed Ferrara on that show for mocking Jim Ross in WCW. But of course.
You know what, that rules actually. Ed Ferrara's getting on my side.
Well, he mocked his Bell's palsy, so it's...
No, damn it, Ed. You couldn't take the high road.
Couldn't just call him a bad announcer or something. But yeah, Chris Harris and James Storm had such a good match on that show. They actually earned their way onto the TNA show and then ended up being very important parts of TNA. So imagine if they just randomly didn't see that Chris Harris James Storm match, I think TNA would be even more dire than it ended up being.
Or if that match was shit. An interesting little factoid about that Storm and Harris match, they actually mentioned it on commentary on the second show.
Yeah, so they were like, these two guys, they're good, and they ended up being good.
Yeah,
so that worked out.
They were pretty good on that second show, actually.
Yeah, they're one of the few redeeming factors about that undercard.
That second show is rough.
We'll get to it. We had the foundation of the commentary team, which Don West was one of the first people brought on. His name was bandied about during the WCW days, but Don West was known as a television shopping network guy. He was at the Shop on Home network where he sold sports memorabilia. He was a pitch guy. He was a sales guy. He was once spoofed on SNL by Will Ferrell because that's how Don West is the most easily spoofable man in the world. But obviously he had never done wrestling before, and I love Don West in this era because he's just so objectively wholesome, and he's so enthusiastic, and he
knows nothing about wrestling.
No, he has no idea what's going on. But AJ Styles does a Hurricane Rana and he loses his mind.
Yeah,
it's the coolest thing he's ever seen in his life, and it's so much fun to watch.
I think he'll get better at it, but there's very clearly some times in these first two shows where Mike Tenay has to be like, all right, you're giving away the show a little bit here, man. We gotta reel it back slightly. when I forgot who it was. It was in one of the matches. I'm just gonna go through the results real quick to see if I can work it out.
Was it when he was shouting, "It's gotta be Malice"?
Maybe. Yeah, that was a great one. There was another one that I can't remember, but it was some match. I'll just say it was the Brian Christopher K Crush match, right? I don't know if it was, but at one point he just goes K Crush is on the Heat segment beating him down, and he just goes, Brian Christopher's gonna come back and win.
I love him working out how pro wrestling works in real time. It's like, oh, this is how this works.
Then Mike goes to him, well, that's just your opinion. We'll have to wait to see.
Oh, I love Don. It's because there's far too much weird cynicism in wrestling commentary these days, where people who clearly don't like what they're calling or start burying what they're calling. And Don West is just out here losing his mind at literally everything in the most sincere way possible. Actually,
I don't mind this trio of people at all. I don't like Ed Ferrara in anything other than the commentary, but actual him just talking shit, I think he's fine.
Scott Hudson was originally considered for play-by-play, but apparently was not available, so they ended up going with Mike Tenay. And also a big thing, apparently Don West was originally supposed to be host of the show, not a color commentator.
You see a bit of that in the first show.
Yeah, because he's actually the first person you see on the first show when he walks out and is like, welcome to the show, blah 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 blah. So Don West's role changed from host to commentator, so I think they knew they needed somebody very professional, very knowledgeable to make up for Don West's lack of knowledge. And like the whole idea was like it was Mike Tenay bringing the expert perspective, Don West bringing the fan perspective, and then Ed Ferrara kind of like the entertainment guy. So like Mike Tenay calls holes, tells stories, Don West just shouts and gets excited, and then Ed Ferrara makes some quips and jokes, which is a nice kind of balance. Everybody has a role.
Yeah, I think it works.
And like Mike Tenay's the best. Mike Tenay is so good on these shows, like just so good. And there's people who don't like Mike Tenay, and I will fight them because like he's knowledgeable and he's passionate and he's enthusiastic, and like he just nails the big calls and he makes things feel important, and he makes like. I think this show would feel a lot more haphazard and a lot less credible if it had an announcer that wasn't as like professional and on it as Mike Tenay was.
Like, he's the voice of TNA to me.
The other big talking point coming out of July 2002, before we get into talking show by show, is the fact that the company basically went broke. So they thought they were getting like 80,000 pay-per-view buys. The first show, they thought they did 80,000. They needed to do 50. That would have been a runaway success, making tons of money. Everything is fine. Like, but WWE were like leaking out to the world. It's like there's not a hope they're getting 80,000. Like, not a solitary hope in hell that 80,000 people bought that show. Our sources are telling us it's closer to 18,000, which would have been dramatically below what they needed. And it turns out WWE were right. Because there was an employee for TNA named Jay Haspin, who was basically their pay-per-view relations and marketing guy. So he would talk to In Demand, he would talk to all the pay-per-view companies and ensure that, you know, everything's running smoothly, they'd get all the promotional material, that all the deals were made, that, you know, TNA aired on the right night with the right content, and it went like, all that went smoothly. That was his job. Turns out, he wasn't doing it.
Damn it, Hassman.
He was being paid six figures as well. This guy is being paid a six-figure salary, just like Vince Russo, and he utterly calamitously did not do his job. It turned out all of his pay-per-view estimates were utterly made up. He would fraudulate? Fraudulate's not a word. Is fraudulate a word, Liam?
Fraudulent's a word. I don't know if fraudulate's a word.
But he would manufacture documents from In Demand. Like, he would print stuff out on their letterhead, telling how many pay-per-view buys they got.
This seems super illegal.
It is. It's just full-on fraud. Because by all accounts, he was basically working for WWE as well at the time, so it was an utter conflict of interest.
How does this happen?
He was working for a marketing company that also worked for WWE. So there's people that believe that either A, it was like flat out sabotage on behalf of a guy who was also working for WWE, or like less maliciously, that it's a guy who just knew he had a marketing gig with WWE, so did not care enough about trying with TNA, even though they were paying him six figures.
Someone clearly didn't do their due diligence ahead of time.
But like, he was working for the company since February. Like, he was one of like the early employees. It was Team Sports, by the way, was the name of the company he was working for, that was also working with WWE. So he was that was a full-on conflict of interest. He was forging documents that suggested they were doing better pay-per-view numbers than they did. Because at one stage, one of the In Demand people showed up to one of their shows and it's like, oh, hey, you know, we got these numbers from Jay, saying we got 80,000. It's like, we haven't talked to Jay in months. Jay's disappeared. He doesn't interact with us. And then they were like, wow, what?
That is definitely a red flag.
Yeah, when the dude who's meant to be like your pay-per-view provider relations is not in fact talking to the pay-per-view providers, that's usually a thing that makes you think, oh geez.
Damn, Jay's at it again.
Yeah, Jay said there's like, oh, we're on Dish Network, we're on Cablevision, everything's fine. And it turns out they weren't. So they didn't have the pay-per-view clearance they thought they had. They had all these press kits that were meant to go out that weren't sent out because he didn't do it. Like, he didn't do anything he was being paid to do.
I hope they, like, sued this dude.
We'll talk about this more next month as well, because they file a lawsuit in August. So we'll talk about the lawsuit against Jay Hassman next month. But we were simply talking about the incompetence of Jay Hassman on this episode.
Jesus.
So from Jerry Jarrett's book, by Hassman's numbers, we thought we had about 175,000 buys for the first three shows. Instead, In Demand is projecting us at about 50,000 buys for the three shows combined. So basically, the company went broke. They realized they were burning through cash at a rate they could not sustain, so they dramatically slashed costs. Because this company started as like, we're going to tour city to city, we're going to bring the show on the road, we're going to try and get like 3,000-4,000 people in these buildings every week. Nope. Then they're like, all right, we're going to do a residency in Nashville. We're going to go to the Municipal Auditorium in Nashville, which was going to be called the TNA Dome.
The Total Nonstop Action Dome.
Yep, the TNA Dome. So we're going to go there. It's a big building. We'll get people in every week. We can have like this big scale. We'll look like a big major league presentation. And then it turned out after the Jay Hassman scandal, they were like, all right, we have no money. We cannot afford these big buildings. We cannot afford these bigger crews. We have to slash costs. We have to like dramatically scale back on everything. We have to cut the number of people we're booking. We have to do a lot to save money because we're going to go broke. And they cut it back. Jerry Jarrett says he wants to scale operations back to under 30,000 per show, considering that it was at one stage projected to be about $250,000 per show. That's a pretty dramatic cut down in costs.
It's just funny that this could even occur. But it's also somewhat impressive that they managed to like make it through this.
Well, they didn't, but
there we go.
They did basically go broke and they were bailed out by Panda. And if they weren't bought by Panda, the company would have closed in September. But we'll get into that when we get to September. But I suppose they did survive. Someone did buy the company. They did find new financing and they did soldier on. But yeah, this was a point at which they were like, oh, geez, everything is going to shit. This is a disaster. Vince
McMahon cackling in his throne.
Because he called Jerry during this period trying to work out what was happening. And maybe he's just like, I'm going to rub it in because I'm sabotaging your company.
Listen, pal.
The week after TNA launched, Vince did his famous Ruthless Aggression promo. And they actually speculated, like Jerry in his book was sending copies of that promo to lawyers, being like, he is actively saying on television he's trying to put us out of business. He is using his monopoly power to take us down.
Should have sued Vince. That would have bankrolled the company at least till September.
So yeah, the company moved from the Municipal Auditorium, the bigger building, to the Nashville Fairgrounds, which would be dubbed the Asylum, become the long-term home of the company for 2 years. It's not quite dubbed the Asylum yet. It'll be dubbed the Asylum in August.
Sure looks like an asylum.
That's the thing. The building, especially for the first week, because it's pay-per-view number 5 that they're there first. The one with Red. No, is it 6? It's the one with Red and Loki. Yeah, it's 6. That's the show that they're in the Asylum first. And it looks like a terrible building. It's like dark. You can clearly see the costs were cut. Like Don West's pay was cut in half.
Yeah, he couldn't afford those shirts anymore.
Yeah, the audio quality is worse, the visual quality is worse, the stage is worse. You can actively just, because their first week in the fairgrounds, it just looks terrible. It looks grim. It feels like a company that's about to go out of business. And by all accounts, they spent the week like painting the place and trying to do it up and make it a little more respectable on pay-per-view by the time they got to number 7.
Buy the building, or were they just like, hey, we need to renovate this building, please let us renovate this building?
They were like, please let us renovate this building. I'm sure they were like, the owners of the building were like, wait, you want to do up our building and we're not going to pay for it? Yeah, sure if you want to paint the building, sure.
But they probably should have just like bought the building at that point.
That would have been too expensive. Maybe you would have saved on rent over time. Who knows? The building probably wasn't expensive to rent anyway.
It looks like an independent.
It does go from like the first, whatever it is, 5 shows look like the real major league. It's a little dated in terms of how it looks. It looks more like late 90s than 2000s. If you compare it to like Raw at the time, it doesn't look like modern and cutting edge. But at least in terms of like the size of the building and the scale of it, it looks like major league. It looks legit. As opposed to when you get to the Asylum, it does look all a little bit grim and a little bit small. And even the crowds are just kind of dead. Like the enthusiasm is kind of sapped out in the Asylum for the first couple of weeks. And it just feels like a company that's going nowhere at the time.
It looks like it wouldn't have been completely out of the realm of possibility for like Ring of Honor or CZW to run this exact building.
Mm-hmm. It probably would have looked like the lighting is probably above like Ring of Honor level, but just the visual aesthetic, not so much. So yeah, Jay Hassman screwed the company over. And I think the worst thing that happened, if you read an interview with the PW Torch, where Jerry Jarrett, it might be denial, it might be like delusion, but they kind of see this as a moment of false hope, where it's like, we were doing none of the marketing and promotions and we had none of the clearances we thought we had. And that's the reason that we have the bad pay-per-view numbers. Like, they kind of like, they think there's a little bit like, oh, you know, if we can get our marketing up to scratch, if we can get our pay-per-view clearance up to scratch, we'll actually be able to do like a kind of reboot. We'll be able to reintroduce ourselves to audiences, and we'll maybe be able to hit the number of like buys we need to break even. So there's like this false hope that if they can get these things in order, that everything will be fine. And I think if you watch these shows, if you see the decline in attendance from the Huntsville shows to the Nashville shows to the Asylum shows, you can see that it's a company that's not hot whatsoever. It's a company that just did not find an audience at the beginning. And they maybe have some false hope that if they can get these things in order, they might find that audience.
Do you think if they had have had all their ducks in a row ahead of that first episode, they would have come off with like a much stronger start, and that would have sustained them to a longer extent?
But they would have probably made more money. Like, that first show probably would have been more successful. They would have been better marketed. More people would have bought it. But then I ask myself the question, would the people who then bought that first pay-per-view continue to buy the pay-per-views based on what they saw? And my answer would still probably be no.
I was also thinking, as I was watching these shows, do you think a more modern subscription-based payment schedule would have helped?
Oh, 100%. If this company launched in 2015 and was just on streaming with $9.99 a month, it would have been a much better financial investment, or for fans at least. You know, it's $10 a month for 4 shows, and we can subscribe, and that's what sustains a ton of indies these days. That model, that's what sustains WWE.
How much were these pay-per-views at the time?
$9.99.
So that's the saying. Like, if this had have launched 2002, $10 a month, you get 4 shows.
Well, in 2002, the technology wasn't there to do that, but yes.
I suppose there's no way to actually initiate reoccurring payments, is there?
Well, I'm interested. Like, I don't think they ever did like a season pass, or maybe they did. Maybe they did I think they did do some like bulk buys. You can get some for cheaper or some stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's what like seems like the natural progression of this to me is like if we're not getting the buys that we want weekly, we might be able to increase that by offering us a price point.
Well, what they did start doing was they started looking into trying to get some kind of syndicated television show as promotion. They did end up finding it. It's what turned into Explosion. But they started looking for more of a marketing vehicle for it, as opposed to trying to cut the price of the shows or do like mass discounts or something like that. Like, I'm not sure what the pay-per-view technology was at the time, that you could probably bulk buy a number of shows at once, but it's probably not sophisticated enough that you could be like, all right, you can pay $9.99 per show, or you can give us $100 a year, and you'll get all our shows. You'll get 52 shows for the price of 10, basically.
I think a lot of people get their money in these like sort of month-by-month systems by people who forget, and they just have reoccurring payments.
That's basically the backbone of all of streaming, yes.
Yeah, so it's like, even if it was a $10 price point for 4 shows a month, you'd still have to have a way of people like actually getting onto their services and purchasing that $10 price point each month, which is just not going to happen to the same sort of extent a reoccurring cycle would. I'm
still paying for Crunchyroll from watching Naruto.
That's what I'm saying. We're bringing it back.
We're freaking paying for Crunchyroll for a year, and we haven't watched a single episode of Naruto, Liam.
Soon to the Patreon.
The Naruto watch along.
Yes.
We'll talk about more about Jay Hassman, I'd imagine, considerably going into the future, especially because the lawsuit is filed the next month. So they start suing each other and they start going to court. Jay Hassman tanked TNA.
The first major heel.
The reason it could work is because like pay-per-view numbers are famously slow to come in. You know, like when someone buys a pay-per-view, by the time the company know exactly how many people have bought it, and by the time like people's credit cards have cleared and the money's been collected and the money's delivered, it's like 3 months down the line before anybody gets money out of the pay-per-view company from the pay-per-view they bought, which is actually that's what contributed to the death of ECW, where ECW had cash flow problems because they couldn't get their pay-per-view money fast enough, and they spent all their money and when they busted, went out of business, and WWE bought them. So the reason he could kind of get away with it is because there's not that instant feedback that there would be if it was like a digital online payment. You know, when you buy a pay-per-view through a digital service like a Fight know exactly how many have they sold immediately, because they see in real time, you bought it, you paid for it, this is how many we sold. As opposed to here, it's like 3 months down the line before they have like firm figures about how many people bought these shows. So Hassman could kind of give them like, you know, these are our estimates, these are our early like projections, and he could spoof and get away with it. And that's why it took the best part of a month to find out he was making shit up, because this information does come in slowly. So his fraud at least was built on, you know, firm foundations that he could get away with it for a while.
It was built on a flawed system.
Yeah, he exploited the system.
That's how most, you know, white-collar crime happens, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and you could argue they probably should have, like, worked it out earlier, and maybe but like, you know, you have a guy who you're employing who's telling you that,
yeah, you're paying a guy 6 figures a year, you expect him to kind of deliver on his job.
And by all accounts, he was faking emails and he was faking all kinds of stuff from In Demand. So like he was going to lengths to do this.
Yeah, it wasn't just like, I'm just gonna like pretend this thing's happening when it isn't. Like, he was actively trying to deceive the company.
Yeah, it's like forwarding emails that tell them about the buy rate, and then in demand we're like, we never sent that email. That's not from us. So what can you do at that stage, you know?
This is all allegedly
yes,
illegal.
Well, we'll talk about what was decided in court over time.
Yes, but that's next episode. So for this point, it is alleged and allegedly, and we are all making jokes, and none of this is real.
I don't think Jay Hassman cares about TNA anymore. How much do you think Jay Hassman thinks about TNA? What's Jay Hassman up to?
I think maybe he needs to recoup those losses and come after our big Patreon bucks.
Oh no, and we just bragged about all the people who signed up. He knows we've got the money.
I know. I just bought my groceries.
Yeah, you have to go to patreon.com/kiddingme to finance our legal fund against Jay Hassman.
Hassman versus Garrett and Jones coming soon.
I like the way you use my first name and your last name.
Kidney and Jones.
I'm like Enya. I just go by Garrett.
J and K.
So one of the reasons that Ken Shamrock disappeared, one of the reasons that Scott Hall disappeared, is we talked about the company going broke in July. August is when the company did like legitimately go broke. They ran out of money. There's a name we haven't mentioned yet that we probably should have mentioned at this stage, and that's Health South. They were the secret investors at the time of TNA. People didn't know who was who was the financial backing behind TNA. People thought it was just the Jarretts. It turned out they did have a financial backer, Health South, run by Richard Scrushy, who I actually interviewed at one stage when I was actually thinking of writing the book, which I still haven't done. And when I talked to him, I was like, so why did you actually invest in TNA? And there was a couple of reasons, some of which didn't quite add up, but some of which made more sense. The first one, he was like, oh, it would be good marketing for Health South if we were in bed with this hot wrestling company and we'd be able to promote Health South, which didn't quite add up because they were a silent partner in the beginning. So it's like, it's not marketing for you at all. You weren't actually mentioning anything regarding being a partner of TNA.
I guess the alternative would have been like, that would have been the long-term plan. Change it up and to make them a forefront of the promotion.
The second one was one that made a little more sense, that the Health South would then provide the health services, because they were a health services company based in Birmingham, Alabama. They would provide the health services to all the wrestlers. So if the wrestlers got hurt, they'd make some money back because they'd provide all the like healthcare and whatnot to the wrestlers.
Wrestlers with healthcare in 2002.
Yeah, and it never panned out in typical fashion with wrestlers and healthcare. And the third one, the one that makes most sense, honestly, and he was very open about that, is he just liked Jeff Jarrett.
Well, Jeff Jarrett's probably an incredibly likable guy when he's in the boardroom, when he's in the marketing office and he's doing a pitch. I'm sure it's very easy to like one Jeff Jarrett.
So yeah, he literally just said, I liked Jeff Jarrett, I believed in him, I wanted to support him, so I did. And relative to the amount of money that Health South was making, the investment, which I think was $1.1 million, according to Jerry's book, was relatively pocket change compared to everything else that was going on in that company. So they're like, yeah, sure, why not?
Just a small loan of $1 million.
Yeah, wouldn't it be nice to be like, oh yeah, that's not that much money, it's fine.
Just a little pocket change on my my vanity project with Jeff.
There is an important note that might inform a little bit more of it, in that Richard Scrushy, the head of Health South, has been indicted for fraud multiple times.
Okay. Now I'm starting to see the pocket change aspect.
He has been criminally charged for defrauding Medicare people. He was in the news in August 2002 for conveniently selling a bunch of Health South shares shortly before a Medicare contract was dropped. So that would be thoroughly inside trading. And yeah, he went to jail at one stage. So.
Allegedly. Now, I don't see the problem with a little bit of insider trading. If you have the knowledge, why not use it?
Well, to be fair, it's not allegedly. He was sentenced to 6 years and 10 months in federal prison in 2007.
Let's just make sure, was chucking allegedly on there just in case.
But yes, so Jerry Jarrett actually speculates in his book that he never ran the investment by his board, and that's why the reason they actually went broke in August of 2002 was Health South gave him a call. It's like, hey guys, we're actually pulling our investment. which is the point at which the company did actually run out of money because Health South was funding the company. And when they said, we're not funding this company anymore, the company was actually out of money. There's a full section in Jerry Jarrett's book, which is fascinating. They play a very high game of high stakes, like poker with Health South, where he talks about, they go into a board meeting and they're basically like, we are willing to declare ourselves bankrupt, where you will be the ones that will be liable for the 1.1 million you invested, plus the 400,000 letter of credit to In Demand. You would be hit in the pocket for 1.5 million plus another 70,000 of expenses that we have currently out. And he literally went into that boardroom meeting with Health South. They didn't have a hand to play. It's like, we are broke. If you're like, we're pulling their investment, we're like, oh, well, then we have to shut the company down, sure. But apparently his high stakes game of poker worked, where they gave him an extra 150,000 to fund through 2 more shows, which is the reason the last 2 shows were taped back to back. The August 21 and August 28 shows were taped on the same night, and they were off on the first show of September because they did an X Division special. They were always supposed to be off on the second show of September because it fell on September 11th, which would have been the first anniversary of 9/11. So they were never going to do a show then. So they cut the first show in September. They were never going to do a show on the second week of September. So they were finished on the 21st of August and essentially were not producing another show until the 18th of September, which is basically a full month. So they had a full month once Health South funded that August 21 taping to find new money because Health South was done with TNA.
The fact that this company is alive in some fashion is truly remarkable. From the beginning, the world was against them.
There was the wide-scale fraud from Jay Hassman.
Allegedly.
There was the Health South pulling funding after only 2 months of the company existing. Their partner pulled their funding, and then the company somehow still survived, because that's what TNA does.
In many ways, a company that can be compared to a cockroach, and mostly, in fact, for the fact that they managed to survive everything.
Listen, the company has embraced it. There's literally a pay-per-view called Hard to Kill now, so...
I think all it took for, like, Impact to sort of gain its notoriety back with people was just an acknowledgement of what it was. If you just go out there and go, yeah, we know TNA, let's go. And everyone's like, oh, alright, they understand now. They're not pretending that it's not TNA.
A little bit of self-awareness.
Yeah, that's all. I think all companies could do with a good dose of self-awareness.
So Health South agreed to fund the company, but they do have a condition. They want to increase the amount of equity they have in the company to 40% until they are paid back in the 1.1 million that they gave in. They hadn't actually paid out, I believe, the entire 1.1 million. They were paying it in installments per TV taping, and they basically called them on the 15th of August being like, we're done, we're not giving you any more. So that's what the big meeting was about, that it's like, you should really continue at least funding us through these tapings, which was for 150,000 more. And they did, but as I said, with the condition that they wanted 40% of the company now, which they were perfectly willing to give away because if the company was about to go bankrupt. 40% of nothing is still nothing. They're perfectly fine giving away 40% of nothing.
It's pretty remarkable how at this stage the Jarretts were like pretty secure in what happened regardless. Like, even if it went bankrupt, it really wouldn't be too much off their backs.
Well, Jerry was quite worried because he was like, it's either going to be the best thing I ever did or I'm going to go broke. Because Jerry was like, I have another 170,000 that I could, in theory, put into the company. If Health South did pull all of their contributions, Jerry was like, I have 170,000 that I have put away that I could put it in. But the question is it worth it? Thankfully, he didn't have to answer that question for himself because Health South eventually ponied up the 150k that allowed them to do that August 21 taping. And then they had as is the story of TNA, a stroke of bizarre luck.
The stroke, brother.
Ah, there you go. That's where the Jeff Jarrett thing. It's actually funny. You mentioned on the watch along, you were looking at Jeff Jarrett's face, being like, "That's just a guy who looks worried."
Yeah, I forget which. It would have been 8, right?
Yeah.
There was this one segment where Jarrett was out there and just like he looks like he's trying to go out there and be Stone Cold Jeff Jarrett, the Jeff Jarrett that we know and love and respect as the ace of the company. But you could just tell on his face that like he wasn't certain about everything going on at this point. Like, he looked like a man who had maybe, like, lost some sleep over the last couple of weeks. He looked like a man who had $1 million of debt.
Which he did. And he looked like a man whose finance was suddenly pulled and was in deep trouble.
But fair play to him. He went out there and he still didn't do the job, but he did a job.
He still went out there and hit people with chairs.
Hey, I'll go $1 million in debt just to hit people with chairs, too.
So after that August 19 meeting with Health South, where they got the extra funding for the August 21 tapings, they basically had two options. They were desperately trying to syndicate TNA internationally. They were trying to sell TNA in international markets, particularly the UK. Didn't have much luck with that. But they also went to their PR firm, their PR advisor, Trifecta Entertainment, run by none other than Dixie Carter. And they were just like, we've got to update Dixie on, the state of things with Jay Haspin. We've got to update Dixie on the state of things with Health South, so our PR people know what's happening and know how to actively manage this situation. And Dixie was just sitting there. They had no idea who Dixie Carter was. Jerry mentions this in his book, that he's just like, he just thought she was a nice Southern girl running a PR firm, until she finds out that her dad runs a $1 billion energy company. And Dixie is like, oh, hey, my dad might actually be interested in this. And that's a story we will continue talking about in September.
So yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was like, was it Dixie being like, hey, I'm the goddess, I'll come in, I'll save your company right now? Or was like the Jared smelling blood and just, oh, someone with money, let's go.
Well, according to Jerry's book, he did not know Dixie had money. They didn't know who Dixie was, because Dixie was just a relation Jeff Jarrett had in the music industry. I think they lived in the same apartment complex at one stage. I remember seeing that story on the History of TNA Year 1 DVD, where they were just loose acquaintances and they just knew her for the PR firm. So they like, yeah, Dixie will do our PR, why not? And they went to her, she was like, oh, my dad runs this gigantic energy company. I'm super rich. He watched all of the shows and liked them, which,
what?
Debatable. Like the quote in Jerry's book is just like, Dixie said that her dad watched all of the shows and knew that we knew wrestling. And I'm like,
I want to see Dixie's dad just hanging out, watching puppet matches, freaking out like us. I hope I don't know if Dixie's dad's alive. If he is in that event, feel free, sign up to the Patreon, $10 tier, get the watch-alongs with us. You can come on the show. Hell, you can even buy the show. Whatever you want to do.
We should definitely get Bob Carter on for watch.
Yeah, let's invite Bob Carter on. We'll ask him, what did you think of those early shows? Because you watched them all. And also, will you please finance us?
Listen, it's like Ted Turner. Everyone's like, when will Ted Turner get back in the wrestling industry?
No, when will Bob Carter get back in the wrestling biz?
But yeah, that's the story we'll continue covering next month. The increased interest in Panda Energy in TNA, and the savior of TNA, basically. I don't think it's a surprise that TNA does not go bust here.
What?
I know, it's like the podcast ends in September.
God, I thought this podcast was going to be over by then.
Well, on the bright side, there's barely any shows in September.
That is a bright side.
Our next episode is going to be very short because there's only 2 episodes to cover. But we will cross that bridge when we get to it. Basically, that going bust influences pretty much everything else we're going to talk about for most of the big stories of the month. Ed Ferrara was, you'll notice, no longer on these shows.
I'll tell you right now, for about half of a show, I did not notice.
Neither did I.
When they cut to the announce table, I was like, wait, Ed's not there.
I was like, wait a minute. Mike and Don, isn't something missing here?
I literally started rolling back in the show to see if there was an angle where he got taken out or something.
Because he didn't call most of the, well, not most, half of the NWA-TNA pay-per-view number 8 because he was in the Dup Cup match.
But then he came back the week after.
Yeah, so he came back on August 14th, and then he was gone for good on August 21. As it turns out, like the company line at the time when he left was like, oh, he's going to pursue other interests. As it turned out, the company had no money, and there was a chance he might not get paid, so he bailed immediately.
Which, again, fair enough.
Yeah, in the book, he was like, Jerry was like, Jeff Jarrett was dumb to hire all his friends, and now he's learning how business really works. It's like, nah, pal. If you're not going to pay somebody, they have every right to bail.
I don't know if you managed to catch my little Ed Ferrara note that I found while searching to the Ed Ferrara Wikipedia.
I didn't. Please tell me.
In July of 2013... Ferrara obtained his Masters of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from the University of Southern Maine's Stone Coast program. Ferrara currently resides in Florida, where he teaches creative writing for entertainment at Full Sail University.
My God, that's why NXT is the way it is.
Yeah, Ed Ferrara's back in the biz, brother.
Do you think he just pokes his head in every so often? It's like, shaking my head. This is no Dup Cup.
No, he pops his head in for a second and he approves. He's like, this Karrion Kross shit's the coolest shit I've ever seen in my life.
Look at my kids. Look at what they're making.
But yeah, basically what I saw from Big Ed was, for the most part, he was just teaching creative writing classes.
So that's the creative endeavor he went to pursue after he left TNA.
And yeah, basically, yeah, Big Ed out there in full sail. That's why the parking lots are so dangerous.
Oh no.
Ed Ferrara is just out there willing and ready to spear someone at any moment.
He is fond of spearing people and groping people based on his television character. So yes, as we were mentioning, they didn't run an episode on 9/11. They didn't run an episode the week before on September 4th. So they were to come back on the 18th if they found funding, which they did. We mentioned at the end of the last episode that TNA ran into Dixie, who was their publicist, and she was just like, hey, my daddy has lots of money. Maybe he'll buy the company. So they spent most of the month of September negotiating that deal. It still wasn't even signed by the end of September. So that tells you like how long and arduous the process was. On September 3rd, they all went down to Dixie's house and office in
Dixieland.
Yes, literal Dixieland, the Panda Energy offices in Texas.
What about Surge Land, huh?
Yeah, I was actually surprised. Like Dixie's already married to Surge at this stage. They're already the couple.
I like Surge and Dixie. I don't know, man.
We'll be seeing Surge a lot on TV. He is responsible for a lot of the banger theme songs we'll be talking about. He performs on some of those.
I appreciate. What does Surge do
in TNA?
In life, like what was his job?
I have no idea. He is a musician, but I don't know what he does as a job.
Was he successful at music, and that's why he was like chosen for this round? Or I assume he was chosen because it was Dixie's husband.
Yes.
Like he's did he have like a history in it, or was he? I don't know. We'll do a Surge retrospect. Surge, come on the podcast. Be our 5th guest.
Yeah, Chad and Surge. They can come on together. They can talk to each other.
Yeah, we'll rehash memories of NWA-TNA episode 12 and 13. Wait, 13 and 14. Wait, whatever.
So they went down to the Panda Energy offices in Texas. They talked to Bob Carter, Janice Carter, who is Dixie's mom, Todd, who's Dixie's brother, Dixie, and her husband Serge, and all of the people, the marketing director, the corporate attorney, CFO, human resources director. They sat down. They had a meeting in the offices where they mostly talked about like wrestling in general, introducing them to like the broader concept of wrestling, to their history in wrestling. They talked a lot about Jeff and Jerry in particular's history of wrestling, because Jerry would have worked a lot with Vince McMahon, and it's actually interesting to read Jerry's book where he's just like, I'm actually quite worried that they didn't talk about our presentation. I was annoyed that we didn't get to our presentation as fast as we did. We were talking about all these other things. It threw me for a loop.
He was ready for like an actual business meeting and not. So here's what wrestling is.
Yeah, it's like, so tell us about Vince. What's Vince really like? You worked for Vince.
Was Dixie a wrestling fan?
Like she says she was, that she grew up and she saw like bits and bobs of it, and basically I think it goes back a lot to the same thing that we were talking about with Richard Scrushy, where he was just like, I like Jeff Jarrett. Like Dixie liked and knew Jeff Jarrett. They lived in the same apartment complex. They ran into each other. They then hired Dixie as years later as the PR for Impact or TNA, and she's just, and they probably saw the opportunity. It's like, well, if we do have a successful wrestling company, AEW, if you look at it at the moment, are firing on all cylinders, selling out 10,000 seat buildings, to have huge TV deals. Like, wrestling can be a lucrative business if you get it right. It's just so many people don't get it right.
I think we mentioned that like Bob was a fan at some point too.
Yeah. So he's in the wrestling business, and he did say that Jeff and Jerry, based on this product, the wrestling business. I'm like, dubious, but
do you think the Jarretts, after like they got all this done and signed and whatever, were like, these fucking idiots? Look at we got them wrapped around our finger. They're gonna dump all this money into TNA. We got them. Like, do you think that was like that was the attitude coming out of it, or like, thank fucking Christ, we've made it?
I think it's more of the latter, and I think it's more like Panda took a lot of the debt off of the heads of the Jarretts, and I think at this stage that's what they were worried about.
Debt too, right?
There was like 1.6 million that they would have been liable for to Health South that ends up getting written off in the negotiations of this deal. That I think they're a great deal relieved that they're not liable for that debt anymore. I think that's like the stage that we're reaching here. It's like, there's a lot of money that's going to come down on us if this actually fails, and obviously we can declare bankrupt, but they no longer became liable for a lot of that debt. It either got written off or renegotiated in the process of dealing with both Panda and Health South, because Health South were a shareholder and had a lot of money in the company, and so a lot of the negotiations were basically Panda playing hardball with Health South where this like you invested that 1.5 million or 1.1, and there was a 400,000 letter of credit as well, which they did keep on. They were responsible for the letter of credit after that. But the 1.1 million that Health South put in, that they were like, hey, we want our money back. Panda are just like, nah, you put that in knowing the risk. You should take the loss. And they did end up taking the loss. It ended up the way they negotiated it was basically Panda would buy the company, they would fund the tapings, but they would also get 51% majority share in the company. So then that would leave the Jarretts with 49%. And then the Jarretts had to tie up a bunch of loose ends by giving Health South 5% of their cut in exchange for the debt that they had, and giving 5% to their lawyer as well, because she threw a fit and was very upset that Panda basically wanted to cut ties with everybody the Jarretts were working with, because Panda were like, oh, your accountants, your lawyers, all of that gone, we'll deal with that from now on.
But to be fair to Big Bob over here, TNA had at this point shown a weakness in that aspect of their production. You know, their behind the scenes characters being involved in things that, you know, ended in lawsuits multiple times.
Yep. TNA is a company that is less than 3 months old and is already involved in, I believe, at least 3 lawsuits.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, I can understand Panda coming in here and being like, yeah, you guys clearly can't handle this because you're fucking it up at every turn, so we'll take over that part of it too.
You guys take the wrestling, we'll take everything else, which is basically what it came down to.
Which is honestly what the money should probably do, you know? Like, I don't think Bushiroad was, like, coming into New Japan and being like, alright, guys.
Ghetto, you're in charge of legal. Jado, you're in charge of marketing.
Dick Togo, come over here and you'll be in charge of human relations. Let's go.
Yeah, we're going to put Toru Yano in charge of accounting.
Yeah, like, Goto, you're the lawyer now. I think they came in with like, hey, you know, we have all the money and the history and the thing. We have a whole infrastructure. That's the word I'm looking for. We're going to do this right, and you just handle the silly slap fights.
So that meeting on September 3rd where they went down to Texas, it seemed to end well. Like Bob insisted on flying them home in the company jet, even though they'd already booked tickets home. Jerry took that as a very good sign, that he's like, take the company jet home. If you're doing that for somebody, it is like a meeting that goes quite well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it also implies like you're a part of the company, doesn't it? It's like, take the company jet home because you're a part of this now. I like Bob. I want to learn more about Bob. This is going to be a Bob retrospective.
Yeah, Bob Carter, wheeler and dealer.
Yeah.
So they spend pretty much the entire month of September negotiating that deal. As mentioned, the Health South ended up coming out with 5% of stock. Panda ended up owning 51% of the company. Obviously, these deals have not been signed by the time, because, like, imagine, like, that must be torturous. A torturous experience to be like, all right, we're out of money, so we have to spend this entire month negotiating. And it seemed to be a great source of frustration for Jerry. That's like, they don't have a hand to play here. Panda have all of the power and all of like the leverage here, because the Jarretts will go bankrupt. Like, it will happen if this deal doesn't happen.
So the whole time he's like, thank God these guys are marks for the business. Because that's the only advantage we have.
That they're willing to actually put money into this thing. It is wild that like they found 2 different investors. That's nearly always where wrestling runs into trouble, like finding actual people willing to put their money where their mouth is. And fair enough, Health South very quickly were like, we're no longer putting our money where our mouth is. But then they found Dixie, like as a stroke of luck through a Jeff Jarrett connection that became stroke. I see what it is, their wordplay. But like a stroke of random luck that this person that he knew from an apartment complex and then hired as his PR manager ended up just being like the source of a great deal of wealth.
It's a good representation of how business really works, isn't it? It's like you can go and do the schooling and do it all. Like, that's never going to be more worthwhile than just knowing the right people and building the right relationships with these people. That's going to get you further than like anything else.
Yeah, any know-how or any ideas. You just have to have enough people willing to give you enough money until it works.
But it's not even like necessarily like, yes, but like it's not even necessarily the money. It's like just knowing the people in the positions who can actually do the stuff, you know? From all levels, not even just, you know, the wrestling business. I think it's really interesting that like, at least at the start with like, and as you can see on the show notes, if you're a Patreon subscriber, how quickly things were happening every day for this company. Like, there was something new going on. It's like, shit, there's a new problem, or there's a new thing, there's a new solution, there's a new discussion. It's just constantly happening. September was a big year for them. Big year, big month. Felt like a year.
And yeah, especially because like they were actively negotiating this deal throughout the entire month. So as I said, there was the September 3 meeting, and then there was all of the details. And then every time they'd have to go back to Health South and be like, well, because Panda were originally like, we'll give them 150k and that's it. And Health South were like, no, they were owed 1.1 million. And eventually the Health South settled for taking 5% of stock instead. But yeah, they're like going back and forth between all of those, going to Panda being like, this is what Health South said, and Panda being like, no, that's not good enough, take this to them instead. And like the Jarretts are just this good like ping pong ball go between these people, trying to sort all this out, trying to get the like all of the parties that have a financial interest in this company at this stage sorted out and dealt with, so that Panda can actually buy the company and have a controlling interest and not have all these hangers on that they have to deal with. And yeah, it is like fascinating. Like Jerry's book is a fascinating like a business startup book as much as it is a pro wrestling book, where they're trying to get this thing off the ground and get this thing ready, and it's like written in real time. It's his diary at the time. That's the format of the book, which I think makes it very interesting, because like there's some days where it's just like, September 5th, I had a nice breakfast and had a good rest today. It was a good day. And then some days they're like, we had this horrible day of negotiations. It was the worst day of my life. We went back and forth between Panda and Health South 75 times until we could finally iron out this deal. I am so exhausted, and I still have to write a television show for this week.
And not to mention, like, as I've been like somewhat perusing what's coming up in the rest of the month, and he was dealing with like some terrible bullshit creative the entire time too.
Let's talk about the terrible bullshit creative.
Like, I'm reading this, and this is like
it's the worst.
Some of the worst shit I've ever seen in my fucking life.
All right, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm reading the words of Jerry Jarrett, quoting Vince Russo. So please,
yeah,
this is very
direct your hate towards.
So September 13th, you're mentioning, where he's faxed over a couple of pages from the September 18th show from Vince Russo, in which, quote, Russo had a storyline that had Brian Lawler accusing Jeff of raping Brian's girlfriend. The girlfriend then comes out and explains that it was not Jeff and the sex was not rape. A black wrestler, Elix Skipper, then comes out and says it was he that had sex with the girlfriend, and then says something like, once you go black, you never go back. Russo also had Brian and Elix cast as a tag team. That's just like...
It's so clear from like hearing how Jerry is writing about this stuff that he fucking hates Vince Russo.
He does. You'll get better quotes about it in later months.
He cannot stand Russo, and he cannot stand his fucking ideas. This is not the wrestling that one Jerry Jarrett wants to be involved in.
Because there's a whole section after that goes into, they had a clear the air meeting with Russo where they talked about the creative direction and all that after this just utterly horrific idea on so many levels. But
and then he comes back a week later with another fucking great idea.
Vince pitched an idea involving Truth, our NWA champion, and a KKK character. After about 5 minutes of his presentation, I interrupted him to advise that I did not like it and we needed to move on.
Do you think, like, Vince is like, hey, bro, Jeff, your dad's ruining everything. He won't let me have my great ideas.
Vince did that same routine in WCW, or his, like, standards and practices are ruining everything by cutting off shit like this. It's like, you can't just do a wrestling show, can you?
No, you have to, like, oh, God. He's like the epitome of Spike TV, isn't he? Just, just a horrid creative mind.
It's just, he's the worst, like, lowest common denominator shock value at all times. That's what this is built on. That's all he knows. And it's like, he can't build interesting characters, even though, like, he's not a bad writer, you know, in terms of, like, skits. He can write, like, decent comedy sometimes, but then he just writes all of this instead, because he has this brain that he apparently can't turn off, and it has to constantly pester him about horrible ideas like the KKK and making light of rape to make weird race jokes.
He reminds me of like one of these like Joe Rogan type stand-up guys. One of these like dude bro stand-up guys. And I wouldn't even compare him to Rogan, to be honest. Even Rogan's got some like decent stuff. I don't even want to talk about Vince Russo, man. He just annoys me.
Well, you're on the wrong podcast then. You're going to have to mention it for a while.
I'll start to become accustomed to it.
Yeah, there's some better Vince Russo burials in later months that I'm excited to get, because as you said, Jerry is still in the phase where he's like, obviously he's just woeful ideas.
Jerry's the only guy that I'm like on the team of. Like, I'm rooting for Jerry Jarrett. He's my hero in this story.
Because there is some quotes in the book where Jerry is just like, it's a shame he didn't learn wrestling from Vince, and Vince didn't teach him how wrestling actually worked.
Yeah. I was just reading the intro where Jerry was talking about his night out on the town with the Carters.
Oh yeah, he's just had a nice day. Yeah, they took him out for a night in the town after the September 13th show. They all took him out for a nice day. They had drinks and dinner, and they were all happy out.
He went out and partied with Scott Hall and Sean Waltman. Scott Hall, Sean Waltman, Brian James.
They were like, they introduced them to the talent that were like the big stars. So it was Waltman, Hall, BG James, Truth, and Jerry Lynn, who were like the ambassadors for the company as we introduced to the money.
I really like that, like, who do we have that can like scrub up and be these perfect representations for the company? And it's like Scott Hall, Sean Waltman, Brian James.
Yeah, that's the company these days, though.
But I suppose like they would have all probably had some experience in doing this kind of thing, schmoozing the money people working for the major companies.
They're workers. This is what they do.
Yeah.
They can work.
Well, I tell you right now, who's not there? AJ Styles. Who's not there? Amazing Red. Who's not there? Loki. It's all the workers that are there who have been in the business for 20 plus years.
Who can schmooze somebody.
And you know Jarrett was there too. Jeffrey Jarrett.
Also doing his schmoozing. He is the ultimate schmoozer, to be fair.
Yeah, I don't even know why you needed anyone else there. Just got Jeff there. We all met at, is that Virago's?
Yeah, Virago's, which is apparently a place in Nashville, I guess. Let me Google it.
I wonder if, let's see if it was a hip party destination.
Virago's is a pioneer of elevated independent restaurants in Nashville. Virago has constantly transformed throughout its 19-year history as the goal.
Wow. Do they tout having the Carters and the Jarretts?
The birthplace of NWA-TNA.
Yeah. Integral to the survival of Impact Wrestling.
Yeah, it's closed until 5 a.m, so we can't get delivery. Oh, it's a sushi restaurant.
Oh. Wonder what kind of sushi Scott Hall, Sean Waltman, Brian James, Ron Killings, Jerry Lynn, the Jarretts, and the Carters had.
That is such a strange group of people going for a dinner.
That is that's my ideal Thanksgiving. Like, I want all of those people.
Especially the Carters.
Yes, well, definitely the Carters. I want to squeeze my way into that family if I can.
Bankroll your wrestling project.
TNA 2.